November the 23rd, 1944. In a conference room deep within the Imperial General Headquarters building in Tokyo, Major General Arisue Seizo, Chief of Intelligence for the Imperial Japanese Army, stood before a wall-sized map of the Pacific. Red pins marked American advances, blue pins marked Japanese defensive positions, and scattered across the map, small aircraft symbols represented the threat everyone in the room was discussing, but no one truly believed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, Arisue had been collecting intelligence on the aircraft for 18 months. The reports sounded like American fantasy, a bomber weighing 70 tons, fully loaded, 4 engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, a wingspan of 141 feet, a service ceiling above 30,000 feet, higher than most Japanese fighters could effectively operate. A range of 3,250 miles, enough to reach Tokyo from distant island bases and return. And the bomb load, 10 tons of explosives, carried farther and higher than any bomber in existence. The Americans claimed they were building these machines by the hundreds, that they had already deployed them to bases in India and China, that soon they would fly from the Marianas, just 1,500 miles from Japan's home islands. Arisue read the intelligence estimates again, his hand steady despite what the numbers meant. If the Americans truly possessed such an aircraft in the quantities they claimed, the war had entered a new phase. A phase where Japan's carefully constructed air defenses, designed to combat B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators, would be rendered obsolete. But in that conference room in November 1944, senior officers from the Imperial Army and Navy met the intelligence with skepticism bordering on dismissal. Lieutenant General Torashiro Kawabe, Deputy Chief of the Army General Staff, spoke first. His voice carried the certainty of a man who had spent 4 decades studying military aviation. "These specifications cannot be accurate," General Kawabe said, tapping the intelligence file. "The Americans are exaggerating their capabilities to demoralize us. It is propaganda. Nothing more. A bomber of this size would require more aluminum than their entire aircraft industry produces. The fuel consumption alone would make long-range operations impossible." Vice Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, nodded in agreement. "Our agents in neutral countries report that American aircraft production numbers are inflated by a factor of 3 or 4. They count prototypes as operational aircraft. They include trainers in their bomber totals. This B-29, if it exists at all, is probably a handful of experimental machines, not a production model, and certainly not hundreds of them." Arisue stood silent. He had heard these arguments before. They comforted men who had built their careers on understanding air warfare as it had been, not as it was becoming. But the intelligence was not coming from American propaganda broadcasts. It was coming from Japanese spies in China, from technical assessments of crashed aircraft components, from monitoring American radio traffic, from photographic reconnaissance of American airfields. On April 26, 1944, 2 Nakajima-Ki 43 Oscar fighters had encountered a B-29 for the first time near the China-India border. The pilots reported an aircraft unlike anything they had seen. Massive, silver, flying at an altitude where their engines struggled to maintain power. They had damaged it with machine gun fire. But the bomber had escaped. That was not propaganda. That was combat experience. In June, Japanese intelligence detected extensive construction at American bases around Chengdu in China, runways being lengthened to over 8,000 feet, fuel storage facilities large enough to supply an entire air force, hardened revetments designed to protect very large aircraft. And on June 15th, as American Marines stormed ashore at Saipan, 75 B-29s took off from those Chinese bases and struck the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata on the island of Kyushu. It was Japan's first strategic bombing since the Doolittle raid 2 years earlier. And it changed everything. Or it should have. The Yawata raid caused minimal damage. Only 47 bombers actually dropped their loads near the target. The fires were quickly contained. 5 B-29s were lost to accidents and mechanical failures, 2 more to Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Japanese radio broadcast the raid as a failure, evidence that American air power remained incapable of seriously threatening the home islands. But Arisue and a handful of other intelligence officers saw something different in the after-action reports. They saw that the Americans had flown long-range bombers all the way from China to Japan and back. They saw that Japanese air defenses, though they had engaged the bombers, had shot down only 2 out of 75. They saw that the B-29 could indeed operate at altitudes where most Japanese fighters struggled. And most importantly, they saw that this was not a one-time demonstration. It was the beginning. Through July, August, and September of 1944, B-29s continued to strike targets across Asia: steelworks in Anshan, Manchuria, aircraft factories on Formosa, oil refineries in Palembang. The raids varied in effectiveness, but they established a pattern. The Americans were learning, their crews were gaining experience, their tactics were improving, and Japanese defenses remained inadequate. Major Yoshitaka Hori, a staff officer at Imperial General Headquarters, began compiling lost statistics in August. Japanese fighters were claiming B-29 kills at a remarkable rate. Pilots reported shooting down 10, 15, sometimes 20 of the big bombers in a single raid. But reconnaissance photos showed American bomber strength remaining constant. New B-29s kept appearing at the Chinese bases, replacing losses faster than Japan could inflict them. Either Japanese pilots were overclaiming their victories, which was common in air combat, or the Americans were producing B-29s at a rate that seemed impossible. Hori suspected both were true. By September, Japanese intelligence had confirmed that American forces had captured Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Mariana Islands. Reconnaissance photos showed immediate construction beginning on enormous airfields. The runways being built on Tinian were longer than any in Japan. Multiple runways, parallel and crossed, capable of launching and recovering hundreds of aircraft simultaneously. General Kawabe called another conference in early October. The subject was air defense of the home islands against the anticipated bomber offensive from the Marianas. Arisue presented updated intelligence estimates. The Americans now had 5 B-29 groups in the Pacific, each with approximately 30 aircraft. That meant roughly 150 operational bombers, with more arriving monthly. The Marianas airfields would be ready by late October or early November. Once operational, the Americans could strike Tokyo with the same ease they had struck Yawata from China, but without the logistical difficulties of supplying bases across the Himalayas. From the Marianas, American bombers would have a straight supply line by sea: unlimited fuel, unlimited bombs, unlimited spare parts, and Japanese submarines and aircraft could not interdict that supply line because American naval and air superiority in the Central Pacific was absolute. Kawabe listened to the briefing and turned to Lieutenant General Torishiro Umezaki, commander of air defenses for the Kanto Plain, which included Tokyo. What forces do we have available to counter this threat? Umezaki consulted his notes. We have approximately 200 fighters assigned to home island defense spread across Honshu and Kyushu. The majority are older models, Ki-43s and Ki-44s. We have perhaps 50 of the newer Ki-84 Hayates, which can operate effectively at high altitude. We also have significant anti-aircraft artillery, but most are positioned to defend against medium-altitude attacks, not bombers, at 30,000 feet. 200 fighters, Arisue thought, against potentially hundreds of B-29s, each armed with 10 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, flying in formation at altitudes where Japanese fighters would struggle to reach them. The mathematics were not favorable. Vice Admiral Kusaka raised the question that everyone was thinking, but few wanted to voice. What is the true production capacity of American industry? How many of these bombers can they actually build? Arisue had those numbers. He had been tracking them for months through intelligence reports, captured documents, and monitoring of American industrial news. The picture they painted was difficult for the officers in the room to accept. According to our most recent estimates, Arisue said, carefully, American aircraft production in 1944 will exceed 96,000 aircraft of all types. This includes approximately 4,000 Boeing B-29s. By comparison, Japan's total aircraft production for 1944 will be approximately 12,000 aircraft. Silence filled the conference room. General Kawabe broke it. Those numbers cannot be accurate. They represent an 8-to-1 production advantage. No nation has ever achieved such industrial disparity. Our intelligence must be faulty. Arisue had anticipated this response. He opened another file. These figures are confirmed by multiple independent sources: British intelligence estimates, captured American logistical documents, monitoring of American civilian radio broadcasts about aircraft plant expansions. The numbers are consistent. America is producing aircraft at a rate we cannot match. More importantly, they are producing the B-29, specifically to bomb Japan. The entire program exists for one purpose: strategic bombardment of Japanese cities and industrial facilities. They call it the Very Heavy Bomber Program. It is the largest single military aircraft project in American history. Arisue paused, letting the implications settle. The Americans are not exaggerating their capabilities. If anything, they may be underestimating them. This is not propaganda. This is industrial reality. But reality, Arisue was learning, was something military institutions resisted when it contradicted their established beliefs. Colonel Saburo Hayashi, a logistics officer, raised a practical objection. Even if the Americans can build these bombers, they cannot maintain them. Our combat experience in China shows that the B-29 suffers frequent engine failures. The Wright R-3350 engine overheats. Maintenance requirements are extensive. The Americans cannot possibly keep hundreds of these aircraft operational simultaneously. It was a fair point. Japanese pilots and ground crews had observed that B-29s frequently aborted missions due to mechanical problems. The massive engines did overheat. The complex remote-controlled gun turrets malfunctioned. The aircraft required more maintenance man-hours than any bomber previously built. But Arisue had also observed something else. American maintenance practices in the Pacific were unlike anything Japanese forces had encountered. The Americans shipped entire spare aircraft across the ocean. They maintained massive supply chains. They assigned 4 or 5 ground crew for every aircraft. They treated maintenance as a systematic industrial process, not an improvised response to breakdowns. If there is one thing American industry excels at, Arisue said quietly, it is solving production and maintenance challenges through sheer scale. They will not have 1 spare engine per aircraft. They will have 10. They will not have 1 maintenance crew per base. They will have hundreds. This is how they fight, with overwhelming material superiority. The conference ended without resolution. The general consensus remained that American claims about B-29 capabilities and production numbers were exaggerated, that Japanese air defenses, though outnumbered, would prove adequate through superior pilot skill and fighting spirit. That strategic bombing, which had failed to break German morale in Europe, would likewise fail against the Japanese people. Arisue returned to his office and continued compiling intelligence reports. On November 1st, an American F-13, a photographic reconnaissance variant of the B-29, overflew Tokyo. It was the first American aircraft over the capital since the Doolittle raid in April 1942. The lone bomber flew at 32,000 feet for 35 minutes, photographing aircraft factories and depot facilities. Japanese fighters scrambled to intercept it. They climbed to meet the intruder, but by the time they reached altitude, the F-13 was already departing. Several fighters attempted pursuit, but the B-29's speed at high altitude allowed it to outrun them. The overflight was not an attack, it was a message. The Americans were demonstrating that they could reach Tokyo whenever they chose, that Japanese air defenses could not prevent them, that the isolation which had protected Japan's home islands for the entire war was ending. On November 24, 98 minutes before noon, air raid sirens wailed across Tokyo for the first time since the Doolittle raid. Civilians looked up at a sky that had been theirs alone for 2.5 years, and there, at an altitude so high they appeared as silver dots against the blue, 111 B-29s approached from the southeast. The first Tokyo raid, as it would be called, targeted the Nakajima aircraft plant in the Musashino district. The weather was terrible. Clouds obscured the target. Jet stream winds at altitude, a phenomenon American meteorologists were still learning about, scattered the bomber formations and made accurate bombing nearly impossible. Only 88 bombers managed to drop their loads. Of those, only 24 hit anywhere near the primary target. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Japanese fighters rose to meet them. 74 aircraft total, flying from bases around Tokyo. They made 40 attacks against the bomber formations. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with black bursts of explosive shells. The Americans lost one bomber, one out of 111 aircraft that participated in the raid. Japanese gunners and pilots claimed dozens of kills. Official reports submitted that evening spoke of 20, 30, even 40 B-29s destroyed. But reconnaissance flights the next day found only one crashed bomber. Major Hori stood in the operations room, comparing pilot reports with photographic evidence. The discrepancy was enormous. Either Japanese pilots were drastically overclaiming their victories, or the B-29s were far more durable than anyone had anticipated. Probably both. He had seen combat films from the raid. The American bombers absorbed damage that would have destroyed any Japanese aircraft. Shells that punctured their fuselages, that tore holes in their wings, that knocked out engines, and still they flew on. Maintained altitude, returned to their bases in the Marianas. The raid itself caused minimal damage to the Nakajima plant. Japanese newspapers reported it as a defensive victory. Radio Tokyo announced that American strategic bombing had failed, just as it had failed over Germany, that Japanese air defenses remained impenetrable, that the B-29 offensive was already defeated. But in the intelligence section of Imperial General Headquarters, Arisue saw different implications. The Americans had sent over 100 bombers on their first raid, not 10, not 20, but over 100. And they had done so, knowing the weather would be poor, knowing the target would be obscured, knowing they might lose significant numbers of aircraft. They had treated this first raid as a training exercise, a test of routes, tactics, formation flying at extreme altitude, navigation over open ocean. They were learning, and they would return. Through December 1944 and January 1945, B-29s returned to Tokyo again and again. Each raid refined their tactics, each mission trained their crews, and each attack demonstrated to Japanese commanders that their initial assessments had been catastrophically wrong. The B-29 was not propaganda. It was real, operational, and being deployed in numbers that exceeded even Arisue's estimates. By January, 24s. Bomber Command, operating from the Marianas, had grown to nearly 500 aircraft. 500. The Americans were launching raids with 100, 200, sometimes 300 bombers simultaneously. Japanese air defenses, designed to counter attacks by dozens of aircraft, were overwhelmed. But the raids remained high-altitude, precision attacks, attempting to strike specific factories and industrial targets. The results were poor. Weather over Japan in winter made accurate bombing nearly impossible. Jet stream winds, sometimes exceeding 200 miles per hour at altitude, pushed bombers miles off course. Clouds obscured targets, and even when conditions were favorable, the Norden bomb site, so effective in the clear skies over Europe, struggled in the complex wind patterns over Japan. Through January, 29th Bomber Command dropped thousands of tons of bombs on Japanese cities and hit almost nothing of strategic value. General Curtis LeMay, who assumed command of 29 Bomber Command in January 1945, reviewed the bombing campaign's results with growing frustration. The B-29 program had cost $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project developing the atomic bomb. It represented the single largest military investment in American history, and after months of operations, it had failed to significantly damage Japan's war-making capacity. LeMay had commanded bomber forces in Europe, where high-altitude precision bombing had proven effective against German industry. But Japan was different. The weather was worse. The targets were more dispersed. Much of Japanese industry operated in small workshops scattered throughout residential areas, not in large, centralized factories. Precision bombing could not destroy what it could not see and could not locate. LeMay began considering alternatives. In Tokyo, Major General Arisue compiled casualty reports from the bombing raids with a mixture of relief and concern. Civilian deaths remained relatively low, a few hundred here, 1,000 there. Nothing compared to the devastation Allied bombing had inflicted on German cities. Japanese air defenses, though unable to stop the raids, were imposing costs. American bomber losses averaged 5 to 7% per mission, not catastrophic, but significant enough to require constant replacement of aircraft and crews. But Arisue noticed something troubling in the pattern of American attacks. The B-29s were beginning to carry incendiary bombs alongside high explosives, small cylinders filled with jellied gasoline designed to start fires rather than create blast damage. On February 25th, 231 B-29s struck Tokyo in daylight with a mixed load of high explosives and incendiaries. The raid destroyed nearly 28,000 buildings and killed over 1,000 civilians. It was the most destructive raid to date, and it demonstrated something that made Arisue's stomach turn. Japanese cities were extraordinarily vulnerable to fire. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, all the major urban centers were built primarily of wood and paper, structures pressed close together in dense neighborhoods, narrow streets that would channel flames, limited firefighting equipment, and a population that had never experienced large-scale incendiary attack. If the Americans shifted from precision bombing to area incendiary attacks, Japanese cities would burn. Arisue prepared a report for the War Council detailing this vulnerability. He recommended immediate evacuation of non-essential civilians from major cities, expansion of fire breaks, construction of concrete air raid shelters, increased production of firefighting equipment. The report was filed and largely ignored. Senior commanders remained focused on the upcoming American invasion of Okinawa. Urban fire defense seemed a secondary concern compared to the defense of Japanese territory. In the Mariana Islands, General LeMay was reaching his own conclusions. On March 4th, a precision bombing raid on Tokyo achieved minimal results despite good weather. LeMay realized that continuing the current strategy would waste the B-29 force without achieving strategic effect. He needed a new approach. That evening, he called a meeting of his wing commanders. What he proposed shocked them. LeMay wanted to attack Tokyo at night, from low altitude, 5,000 to 7,000 feet instead of 30,000. He wanted to strip the B-29s of most of their defensive guns to carry more bombs. He wanted to load the aircraft entirely with incendiaries, and he wanted to concentrate the attack on a specific area, the Shitamachi district of eastern Tokyo, where over 1 million people lived in wooden houses pressed together in a district measuring barely 16 square miles. His officers objected immediately. Low-altitude attacks would expose the bombers to every anti-aircraft gun in the city. Night operations were dangerous enough at high altitude. Removing defensive guns would leave the aircraft vulnerable to fighter attack. And concentrating incendiaries on a residential district meant killing tens of thousands of civilians. LeMay acknowledged all these concerns. Then he explained his reasoning. Japanese fighter defenses were designed for high-altitude interception. Flying low would allow B-29s to approach under radar coverage and give fighters less time to reach attack altitude. Night operations would reduce the effectiveness of both fighters and anti-aircraft fire, Removing the guns would increase bomb loads by 65% and increase speed, making the bombers harder to catch. And targeting the Shitamachi district was not about killing civilians. It was about destroying the hundreds of small workshops and shadow factories scattered throughout the residential area that produced components for Japanese aircraft. More than 50% of Tokyo's industrial capacity was dispersed among residential and commercial neighborhoods. You could not destroy it with precision bombing because there were no precise targets, but you could destroy it with fire. LeMay did not formally request permission for this change in tactics. He notified 20th Air Force Headquarters on March 8th, choosing a day when General Hap Arnold and his Chief of Staff would be absent. LeMay later admitted he wanted to protect Arnold from blame if the raid failed. On March 9th, 1945, B-29 crews gathered for their briefing on Tinian and Saipan when they learned the mission parameters: stripping guns, flying low at night, targeting a residential district. Many were skeptical. Some were horrified. They were being asked to deliberately firebomb a city of civilians. The briefing officer was blunt. The target was not civilians. It was Japanese war industry dispersed throughout the Shitamachi district. But yes, civilians would die. Tens of thousands of them. Probably. If crews were shot down and captured in Japanese territory, they should expect the worst treatment imaginable because they would have just killed the families of the people who captured them. The best chance of survival was to ditch in the ocean, where American rescue crews could recover them. 334 B-29s were prepared for the mission. Each carried approximately 7 tons of M69 incendiary cluster bombs. Each cluster contained 38 individual bomblets filled with napalm, jellied gasoline that burned at over 2,000 degrees. Do the mathematics. 334 bombers, each carrying dozens of clusters, each cluster releasing 38 bomblets. Over 500,000 individual incendiary devices would fall on 16 square miles of wooden buildings. The first aircraft took off from Tinian and Saipan at dusk on March 9th. They flew individually rather than in formation, navigating by radar and dead reckoning across 6 hours of open ocean. The plan called for Pathfinder aircraft to mark the target with incendiaries in an X pattern. Follow-on bombers would simply aim for the flames. In Tokyo, at the evening of March 9th, was cold and windy. Gusts reached 30 miles per hour, unusual for the season. Most civilians went to bed expecting another quiet night. The B-29 raids had become routine. The sirens wailed occasionally. Bombs fell somewhere. But the city remained largely intact. After months of attacks, at 11:48, the air raid sirens began their familiar wail. In the War Ministry building, Major General Arisue stood at his window, watching searchlights probe the night sky. 8 minutes later, his aide burst through the door, face pale. "Sir, observation posts are reporting something strange. The B-29s are coming in low, very low, 5,000 to 7,000 feet, maybe lower. And there are dozens of them, maybe more than 100. Arisue turned from the window. Low-altitude bombing. That made no sense. The Americans had spent months perfecting high-altitude tactics specifically to stay beyond the reach of Japanese defenses. Flying low exposed them to every weapon in the city. How low? 5,000 to 7,000 feet, sir. And the early reports say they're not in formation. Individual aircraft coming from different directions. Through the window, Arisue saw the first clusters of incendiaries ignite, not the usual high-explosive bombs with their sharp detonations and columns of smoke. These were different. Thousands of small fires blooming across the Shitamachi district like deadly flowers. The working-class neighborhoods east of the Sumida River, where wooden houses pressed against each other in dense warrens, where 1 million people slept. By midnight, the fires had merged into a single mass. Arisue could feel the heat through the glass, though the inferno was miles away. The wind, that night, gusting to 30 miles per hour, was driving the flames through the narrow streets faster than people could run. The phone on his desk rang constantly. Reports from fire brigades, police stations, military posts, each one more desperate than the last. The fires were creating their own weather system, generating winds so powerful they were tearing people off their feet and hurling them into the flames. At the imperial palace, barely 2 miles from the war ministry, Emperor Hirohito had been awakened by his chamberlain at midnight. The emperor, 43 years old, stood at the window of his private quarters, watching the eastern sky turn orange. He said nothing for several minutes. Behind him, Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal Kido waited, unsure whether to speak. "How many aircraft?" the emperor finally asked. "The reports are still coming in, Your Majesty. At least 200. Possibly 300. The emperor's hands, Kido noticed, were trembling slightly. "And they are using incendiaries?" "Yes, Your Majesty." Hirohito had studied military science since childhood. He understood what incendiaries meant when dropped on a city where 90% of the structures were wood. He understood what 300 bombers could do in a single night. At 1:15 in the morning, Arisue received a call from the commander of the 1st Anti-Aircraft Division. The man was shouting to be heard over the roar of flames in the background. "Hey, we cannot stop them. They are too low and there are too many. Our guns cannot traverse fast enough. The fire is—" The line went dead. The B-29s kept coming for 2 more hours. They flew in streams, one after another, each dropping clusters of M69 incendiary bombs, 6-pound cylinders filled with napalm that burst into white-hot flames on impact. Each bomber carried 40 clusters. Each cluster held 38 bomblets. Do the mathematics again, because the numbers defined what was happening below. 334 bombers eventually participated in the raid. Each dropped more than 500 individual firebombs. 500,000 separate fires ignited across 16 square miles of the most densely populated urban area on Earth. Major Yoshitaka Hori was on duty that night in the underground command center at Imperial General Headquarters. He watched the reports accumulate on the situation map. Red pins for fires, black pins for destroyed fire stations, white pins for hospitals, overwhelmed with casualties. By 2 in the morning, there were so many pins, the map was barely visible beneath them. "Get me casualty estimates," Hori ordered a subordinate. The young lieutenant looked at him helplessly. "Sir, the police cannot reach most of the affected areas. The fires are still burning. The bridges across the Sumida are jammed with people trying to escape. Some of the bridges have collapsed from the heat. We have reports of people jumping into the river and boiling to death because the water itself is heating up." Hori felt his stomach turn. He had served in China. He had seen what war did to cities, but this was different. This was Tokyo, his city, the heart of the empire. "Give me your best estimate." The lieutenant consulted his notes, his hand shaking. "Based on population density in the affected areas and the percentage of structures destroyed, tens of thousands dead, sir. Maybe more, maybe many more. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At 3:30 in the morning, the last B-29 departed. The fires burned on. They would burn for 4 more days. As dawn broke on March 10th, War Minister General Korechika Anami finally reached the War Ministry. He had walked the last 3 miles because the roads were impassable. His uniform was covered in ash. His face was streaked with soot and sweat. He found Arisue in his office, still standing at the window, watching smoke rise from the ruins. "Show me," Anami said. They drove east in a military car as close as the fires would allow. At the edge of the burn zone, Anami got out and walked forward. The heat was still intense enough to make breathing difficult. What had been streets were now corridors between walls of ash. Bodies lay everywhere. Most were burned beyond recognition. Some had been caught in the open and were now charred shapes barely identifiable as human. Others had sought shelter in canals and water tanks where they had been boiled alive. Still others had been asphyxiated by smoke before the flames reached them. These looked almost peaceful, as if sleeping, except for their blue lips and the way their hands clutched at their throats. Anami, who had commanded troops in some of the worst fighting in China and Manchuria, who had seen cities burn and civilians die, stood in the ruins of Tokyo and wept, not openly, not dramatically, just tears running down his ash-stained face as he surveyed the destruction. "How many?" he asked quietly. "We do not know yet, sir. The fires are still too intense to conduct proper searches, but based on the population density of the Shitamachi district and the extent of the destruction—" Arisue paused. 80,000 at minimum, possibly more than 100,000. 100,000 dead in a single night, more than Hiroshima would kill 5 months later, more than any military action in human history up to that point. Anami closed his eyes. "And the bombers? 14 lost, sir, out of more than 300. 14. Less than 5%. The Americans had traded 14 aircraft and perhaps 140 crewmen for 100,000 Japanese civilians. The mathematics of it was obscene, and the strategic implications were worse. The War Council finally convened at noon on March 10th in an emergency session at the Imperial Palace. They met in an underground bunker, though the fires were miles away now. Emperor Hirohito attended personally, which was unusual. Normally, he remained silent during these meetings, a symbolic presence, while his ministers debated. Today, he spoke first. Explain to me what happened last night." General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, stood to brief. He was 62 years old, a career military man who had spent 40 years preparing for war. Nothing in that preparation had equipped him for this. Your Majesty, at approximately 11:50, American B-29 bombers began attacking Tokyo with incendiary bombs. The attack lasted approximately 2.5 hours. The bombers flew at unusually low altitude, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, which reduced the effectiveness of our anti-aircraft defenses. They dropped M-69 incendiary cluster bombs designed to start fires in wooden structures. The bombs were highly effective. Strong winds that night, gusting to 30 miles per hour, spread the fires rapidly through the Shitamachi district. "Casualties?" the Emperor asked. "Still being assessed, Your Majesty. Preliminary estimates suggest tens of thousands dead, possibly exceeding 100,000. Perhaps as many as 1 million people are now homeless. 16 square miles of the city have been destroyed." The room was silent. Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, who had opposed the war from the beginning, stared at his hands. Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso looked as if he might be sick. War Minister Anami stood rigid, his face expressionless. "And our response?" the Emperor continued. Umezu glanced at Anami, who stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we shot down 14 enemy bombers. Our night fighter units engaged where possible, but the Americans attacked in a concentrated stream that overwhelmed our defenses. Our anti-aircraft guns were effective at low altitude, but there were simply too many targets. The fires spread too quickly for our fire brigades to contain them. The wind created a firestorm effect that made firefighting impossible in many areas. 14 aircraft, the Emperor said quietly. Out of how many? Intelligence estimates 334 bombers participated in the raid, Your Majesty. The Emperor looked at Anami directly. General, I want you to understand what I'm asking. The Americans lost 14 aircraft to kill 100,000 of my subjects and destroy 16 square miles of my capital. What does this tell us about their capability to continue such attacks? Anami understood perfectly. The Emperor was asking whether Japan could survive a sustained campaign of such raids, whether the war was still winnable, whether continuing to fight made any strategic sense at all. Your Majesty, Anami began carefully, the Americans have approximately 500 B-29 bombers in the Marianas. If they can sustain this operational tempo, they could attack every major city in Japan within a matter of months. Our air defenses are inadequate against mass low-altitude incendiary raids. Our fighter strength is depleted. We lack the fuel and pilots to mount effective interceptions, and our cities, as Your Majesty knows, are particularly vulnerable to fire. Then we must evacuate the cities, said Prime Minister Koiso. Move the population to the countryside. Disperse the industrial facilities. General Umezu shook his head. Evacuate 12 million people from the major cities. With what transportation? To where? And how would we feed them? Our rice production is already insufficient. Moving millions more people into agricultural areas would create mass starvation. Then what do you propose? Koiso demanded. The question hung in the air. What could they propose? The Americans controlled the seas around Japan. They controlled the skies above Japan. They could burn Japanese cities at will. And there was nothing the imperial military could do to stop them. Admiral Yonai spoke for the first time. Gentlemen, I believe we must face certain realities. Last night's raid was not an isolated incident. It was a demonstration of capability. The Americans have shown us that they can destroy our cities whenever they choose. They have shown us that our defenses cannot stop them. And they have shown us that they are willing to use this capability without restraint. He paused, looking around the table. The question is not whether they will continue these attacks. They will. The question is whether we can achieve any of our war aims before they burn every city in Japan to the ground. We fight on, Anami said firmly. We make them pay for every foot of Japanese soil. We make the cost of invasion so high that they will negotiate rather than continue. Last night was terrible, yes. But the Japanese people are strong. They will endure. They will sacrifice. And when the Americans finally attempt to land troops on our shores, we will destroy them on the beaches. With what forces? Yonai asked quietly. Our best divisions are scattered across the Pacific, cut off and starving. Our Navy barely exists. Our Air Force is reduced to training pilots and obsolete aircraft for kamikaze missions. And now our cities are burning. What exactly will we fight with, General? Anami's face flushed with anger. We fight with the spirit of Yamato. We fight with the courage of the samurai. We fight because surrender is unthinkable. Spirit does not stop incendiary bombs, Yonai replied. Emperor Hirohito raised his hand slightly, and both men fell silent. I wish to tour the damaged areas, he said. I wish to see for myself what has been done to my capital and my people. The ministers exchanged glances. The emperor never left the palace grounds during wartime. Security concerns made it impossible. But Hirohito's tone made clear this was not a request. Your Majesty, Kido said carefully. The situation in the affected areas is still chaotic. Fires are still burning. Bodies have not been recovered. It would be dangerous and distressing. I will see it, the Emperor said flatly. In that moment, sitting in the underground bunker beneath the imperial palace, surrounded by generals and admirals who had spent their lives preparing for war, something shifted. The men in that room had believed the B-29 was propaganda. That American industrial capacity was exaggerated. That Japanese defenses would prove adequate. That strategic bombing could not break Japanese morale. They had been wrong about everything. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today.